Over the past 2.5 years of ceasefire, Saudi Arabia's complete failure in Yemen has become more and more apparent. The missiles of Yemen's Houthi government have effectively established deterrence with the Gulf monarchies. The Saudi ability to bomb Yemen without fear of retaliation seems to be over. Saudi Arabia is now trying to sign a deal with the Houthis that would completely screw over the proxy government the Saudis have kept afloat since 2015. This likely Saudi-Houthi deal is a complete humiliation for Riyadh, but it does have the silver lining of royally screwing over Saudi Arabia's frenemy, the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is the only entity that so far seems to have benefited from the horrific invasion of Yemen that the Gulf monarchies launched in early 2015. The complete failure of the Saudi-UAE invasion of Yemen can be hard to understand if you don't understand Yemen's history. Over the past 5 episodes of this Yemen versus Empire series, I've documented how Yemen's diverse factions have continually frustrated the aspirations of Ottoman, British, Egyptian, US, and Soviet empire builders. I've been wanting to put Yemen's history in its full imperial context for years now. Back in 2020, I did a couple videos diving into the way that Britain had undermined Egypt for 4 decades before eventually conquering the place in 1882. As I made those videos, I was struck by how similar that process was to the way that Saudi Arabia has been treating Yemen for the past 60 years. The Saudis and the Emiratis have been doing 19th century style imperialism in Yemen, pure and simple. The fact that the Gulf monarchs don't happen to be Europeans doesn't make their colonial project any less grubby or dishonorable. The big difference today, of course, is that the invading imperialists have lost. In 2014, just like the Egypt of 1881, elements of Yemeni society rose up against decades of foreign influence to try to sweep the invaders and collaborators out. In 2015, like the British of 1882, the Saudis invaded Yemen, expecting to quickly crush all opposition. The British invaders of 1882 won, and they controlled Egypt until the 1950s. But the Saudi invaders of Yemen have lost completely. And history leads me to believe that the UAE, which seems to have benefited at this point, will inevitably lose as well. The roots of this conflict go far beyond the 2015 invasion. Back in 2017, I put out a video claiming that what was really going on in Yemen was not one, but 2 separate wars of independence. North Yemen's war to be free from decades of Saudi meddling, and South Yemen's war to be free of the North, with which it had been unhappily unified since 1990. That old video is still worth watching, and there's a link in the description, but my reading since makes me want to revise it a bit. Saudi Arabia hasn't just been trying to take Yemen over since 2015. That effort has lasted over a century. As long as there has been a Saudi Arabia, it has been trying to colonize Yemen. If you want to know more about this 100-year effort, you can watch the first 5 episodes of this Yemen versus Empire series. In part 1, covering the 1500s through the 1930s, we documented how the upstart country of Saudi Arabia used British support to take away historic Yemeni land, right before oil money launched the Saudis into the stratosphere economically. In part 2, taking the story from the 1930s to the 1970s, we illustrated how Saudi Arabia used a Yemeni civil war to win its competition with Egypt. In part 3, covering the 1960s to the 1990s, we showed how Saudi religious imperialism created new divisions in Yemeni society, leading to the rise of Sunni jihadists like Al-Qaeda and the Houthis that rose to fight them. In part 4, on the late 1990s through 2014, we showed how the Saudi-generated 9/11 era rocked Yemen to its core. And in part 5, on 2010 through 2017, we documented the fall of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was sometimes Saudi Arabia's most useful client and sometimes their most irritating enemy. Today, we will finally be covering the most recent decade and the humiliating failure of Saudi Arabia's open attempt to conquer Yemen, starting off in 2011 with the temporary fall of Yemen's 3-decade dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Other Arab dictators fell much more quickly during the Arab Spring. Saleh, however, was wily and managed to delay the end of his presidency, even surviving an assassination attempt in June 2011. But the opposition could see that they were winning and finally forced him to resign in November of 2011. Saleh's prolonged fall from power gave the Gulf countries an opportunity. The US, the UN, and the EU all played small parts in Saleh's fall, but they agreed to let Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates lead the way, which introduced the somewhat ridiculous spectacle of two Gulf monarchies managing a democratic transition. Scholar Alexandra Stark, in her useful book, The Yemen Model, suggests that it might have been a phone call from Saudi King Abdullah that finally convinced Saleh to resign in November 2011. Yemen's transition framework was known as the Gulf Cooperation Council Initiative. Yemen's political transition quite literally had the Gulf monarchs' names all over it. The GCC initiative was driven, of course, by Saudi and Emirati interests and money. Yemen's democracy was handed over to a bunch of monarchs who are dedicated to the idea that democracy doesn't work for Arabs. I wonder why that didn't work out. We covered the failure of Yemen's transitional government in detail in the last episode, so for today, let's just focus on how outside influence, especially Gulf influence, helped to bring about that failure. Ali Abdullah Saleh was a famous piece of work, but he at least had experience and some control of Yemen and its institutions. It meant he could push back a little bit on U.S. and Gulf demands. New President Abd Rabbu Mansur Hadi, who started his 11-year-long, 2-year term in 2012, had none of that power. His weakness led to a vicious cycle where his lack of legitimacy in Yemen meant he needed more outside funding and support, which led him to take actions serving foreign interests that further undermined his legitimacy. Making things worse, Hadi was a complete doormat for U.S. counterterrorism interests. He allowed the United States to bomb Yemen even more frequently than Saleh had, building rage among the public. Hadi's dependence on Gulf support meant he was constantly handing out sweetheart deals to outside businesses that Saleh would have at least gotten decent kickbacks for. The United Arab Emirates in particular won favorable deals in Yemeni ports that Saudi Arabia was reportedly quite jealous of. Most commentators agree that Hadi went far beyond his limited mandate as a transitional figure, signing over important parts of Yemen's economy to outsiders. Gulf influence poisoned the attempted transition to democracy through corruption, but also through Saudi Arabia's dislike and the UAE's pathological hatred of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Islah Party, probably 2012's most well-established political actor, with a more credible commitment to democracy than many other elements on the Yemeni political scene, is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So Hadi was obligated by his Gulf sponsors to spend as much time working against Islah as he did working against the Houthis that eventually overthrew him. In early 2014, the National Dialogue Conference ended, failing to resolve any of Yemen's problems, and President Hadi celebrated by awarding himself a third year in power. By the end of the year, Yemen's transitional government had fallen apart, and the Houthis, implacable enemies of Saudi Arabia, were in control of Yemen's capital. 2015 saw the end of an era in Yemen's most powerful neighbor. Saudi King Abdullah had only ruled in his own name since 2005, but had ruled as regent since 1996 in the name of his incapacitated brother. Abdullah's 19 years in power had seen great failures, like Saudi complicity in 9/11, but they had also been rooted in the careful, measured traditions of the Saudi royal family. Abdullah had always preferred manipulation to the use of military force. He must have remembered how successfully Saudi Arabia had crushed Nasser's Egypt, a country that had been stupid enough to send its military into Yemen. In that 1960s conflict, Saudi Arabia had stayed carefully off stage while sending a flood of money and weapons to the Yemeni forces that ended up crushing Nasser's pan-Arab nationalist dreams. King Abdullah had no interest in making Egypt's mistake in Yemen. Tragically for Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and the world, Abdullah died in January 2015. The 90-year-old king was replaced by his 79-year-old brother, King Salman, who was already suspected of suffering from Alzheimer's. From the beginning, Salman chose to rely on his son, Mohammed bin Salman, only 30 years old in 2015, who he installed as defense minister and deputy crown prince shortly after coming to power. MBS, as he would come to be known, didn't have King Abdullah's wisdom or restraint. He decided to make his mark and demonstrate Saudi power by crushing Yemen's Houthis in a decisive storm. Didn't work out so well. Meanwhile, in Yemen, by January 2015, Hadi had realized his mistake in not putting up a fight when the Houthis took the capital the previous September. At the end of the third year of his 2-year term, he resigned and was promptly put under house arrest. In February, he fled to Aden, Yemen's second city and the capital of the south. When he got to Aden, Hadi attempted to rescind his resignation and reconstitute the government of Yemen from the south. Unfortunately, all this accomplished was giving the Houthis the excuse they needed to conquer the rest of the country. By March, heavy fighting had reached Aden, and Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia, where he continued his lobbying for a Saudi intervention. It's really important to understand what Yemen actually looked like in March of 2015 on the cusp of the Saudi-UAE invasion. Yemen had already had a civil war. The civil war was over, and the Houthis had won, almost a decade ago. The map can be a bit deceiving. The 2015 Houthis only seemed to control the west of the country. But in truth, their then impending conquest of Aden would have been the squashing of the last resistance. The east of Yemen is almost all desert. The people who live in the oases and port cities of Hadramaut and Al-Mahra governorates are a tiny percentage of Yemen's population, and they have usually been isolated from the mainstream of Yemeni politics. In 2015, the Yemeni civil war was over. Saudi Arabia and the UAE weren't invading to defend a government with any legitimacy. They were invading to correct the results of a civil war that they did not like. So why were they allowed to do that? After all, the United States had dramatically stepped up its involvement in the Middle East in 1990 to punish Iraq for invading its much weaker neighbor. Preventing things like the Saudi invasion of Yemen is supposed to be what the U.S. rules-based order is all about. Lloyd Austin, later Biden's Secretary of Defense, was the general in charge of U.S. Middle East forces in 2015, and he was reportedly enraged by the intervention, accurately predicting that it would be a colossal failure that would create massive problems for the United States down the line. So why did we do it? Well, the Obama administration had larger priorities. They were putting together a deal to restrain Iran's nuclear program, which Saudi Arabia absolutely hated. Allowing MBS to go forward with his idiotic invasion plans was seen as a sort of trade. This strikes me as a pretty straightforward case of bribery. Saudi Arabia has no real power over the United States, but they do fund a lot of jobs in Washington, D.C. So we help them kill a couple 100,000 people in Yemen. It might even have been worth it if the Iran nuclear deal had been allowed to stand. With the nuclear issue resolved, the U.S. would be able to finally disengage from the region. Iran would have had broader economic ties that would have promoted peace. Netanyahu probably wouldn't be in power, which means that October 7th is unlikely to have ever happened. About 1,000 Israelis and a couple 100,000 more Gazans would probably be alive today. But that's all sunny speculation. We'll never know what actually would have happened because in 2018, Donald Trump killed the deal, creating the current crappy status quo with Iran, and we ended up letting Saudi Arabia's failed and brutal war create a new and much more powerful version of Hezbollah in Yemen. Success all around. Diplomatically, the U.S. participation in the Saudi invasion went as far as a series of UN Security Council resolutions, claiming that Hadi, a president whose term had ended, who had resigned, and who lived in Saudi Arabia, was the legitimate internationally recognized president of Yemen. This absurd fiction lived on from 2015 all the way up until 2022, the 11th year of Hadi's 2-year term in office. Sadly, U.S. support for the Gulf's war on Yemen was not just diplomatic. None of the atrocities of the past decade would have been possible without the United States military-industrial complex. First and foremost would be the continued flow of U.S. weapons to the Saudi Air Force, which became a flood after 2015. If that had stopped at any point, the war would have stopped. But the United States went far beyond the supply of weapons to helping to pick the targets. The numbers waxed and waned with U.S. politics around the conflict, but at the outset of the war, dozens of U.S. intelligence officers were on the ground in Riyadh helping to plan attacks. For much of the active part of the war, the Saudi Air Force was reliant on U.S. military planes for aerial refueling. Maybe the worst thing the U.S. did, and continues to do, doesn't involve any explosions. The Saudi air and sea blockade of Yemen is nominally supposed to just stop weapons, but it has slowed down and sometimes stopped all import of food and fuel into the country, generating famine and some of this century's worst epidemics of cholera and other diseases. Hungry people have weaker immune systems, so Yemen had an even worse COVID experience than everybody else, primarily at U.S. hands. Saudi Arabia killed thousands upon thousands of innocent Yemenis with its bombing. It killed vastly more with its blockade. The United States and our British and French vassals provided ships and intelligence in support of this deeply evil crime against humanity. I don't choose to use the word genocide for what happened in Yemen, but for those who do, the blockade is their main source of evidence. The Saudis expected to crush the Houthis in weeks. Almost a decade later, their failure is clear. The Houthis are more powerful than they have ever been. Though Saudi failure was already very apparent by the end of 2015, the first year of the war. Aden, Yemen's second most important city and the capital of the south, was liberated from the Houthis in July of 2015. That was the last serious victory the Saudi-UAE coalition would win, even though the war dragged on until 2022. This failure can seem hard to understand. The very top and bottom of Yemen's power structure, Saleh and the Houthis, made their alliance public in 2015. Saudi Arabia and the UAE had every other element of Yemen's pre-war hierarchy to work with. Tribes, political parties, Ali Mohsen sections of the army, southern separatists, plus Gulf money and weapons should have allowed them to put together a formidable alternative to the Houthis. Instead, Saudi Arabia and the UAE used all these factions to jockey for position against each other. Like every other Arab country, the most cohesive political party outside of the old regime was an Islamist one with connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. This Islah party had a large electoral constituency and close links to many traditional Yemeni power bases. Saudi Arabia was willing to work with Islah to beat the Houthis, but the UAE hates the concept of Arab democracy even more than they hated the idea of losing a war. So they've spent the past decade fighting Islah almost as intensely as they've been fighting the Houthis, if not more intensely. In 2018, BuzzFeed News broke the extraordinary story that the UAE was paying U.S. mercenaries to assassinate highly placed members of the anti-Houthi internationally recognized government that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were supposedly trying to help take over the country. The 53 separate, successful and failed assassination attempts against Islah party figures between 2016 and 2018 are probably the most egregious example of the Gulf coalition's dysfunction, but the anti-Houthi forces have never been unified in any serious way. Everything we say about the Yemeni conflict in the south is an oversimplification, but speaking generally, the invading coalition has tended to be divided along the following lines. The Saudis were more often affiliated with Islah and the internationally recognized Hadi government that controlled progressively less and less territory as the war went on. The UAE leans more towards southern separatists and Salafist militias that were constantly undermining and occasionally engaged in open warfare against the Hadi government the Gulf coalition supposedly supported. The UAE-supported militias tend to be the only non-Houthi forces in Yemen that are capable of taking or holding on to any real territory. The Saudi inability to put together any kind of serious invasion force is one of the main reasons the invasion failed. At the outset of the fight, MBS was disappointed to find that the cannon fodder he had been expecting to use, the Pakistanis and the Egyptians, had no interest in getting involved. So the Saudis hired the Sudanese, specifically the Janjaweed militias that had earned worldwide infamy for the Darfur genocide at the beginning of this century. Quick side note, the Janjaweed militias pulled out of Yemen in 2019 to focus on their own country, where they are known as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. The Gulf money that the RSF got for fighting in Yemen has a lot to do with why those monsters are currently winning the horrific civil war in Sudan. When you combine the international cast of war criminals on the ground with the generalized chaos of the forces on the anti-Houthi side and the Saudi emphasis on bombing, it's not surprising that the Gulf invasion of Yemen quickly led to a hideous level of casualties. As early as the fall of 2015, the United Nations was reporting that 2/3 of civilian casualties in the conflict were a result of Saudi-allied strikes. By the one-year anniversary of the war in March 2016, the Saudis had carried out almost 6,000 separate airstrikes to very little military benefit and at great civilian cost. Finally, by the end of 2016, the Obama administration had had enough. They had their Iran nuclear deal, and the Saudi invasion that was supposed to be completed successfully in a few weeks' time was dragging through a second murderous year of failure. On October 9, 2016, a Saudi attack on a funeral killed 140 civilians, and the Obama administration dramatically curtailed U.S. participation in the invasion. We withdrew U.S. personnel, publicly condemned the Gulf Coalition's conduct, and suspended some weapons sales. This did not immediately end the war. The Obama administration could have gone much further. But it did slow the pace of airstrikes. 8 years later, now that the Houthis have basically defeated the Saudis and are threatening Israel, hawks in Washington, D.C. and many anti-Houthi Yemenis are constantly whining about the U.S.'s brief periods of squeamishness. Surely, if we'd been willing to murder more innocents back then, the Houthis wouldn't be as powerful as they are today. Now, I wouldn't find that argument persuasive under any circumstances. We've seen again and again in this series how more brutality just makes the Houthis stronger. But that argument has also been disproven by the kind of natural experiment that geopolitics almost never provides. When Donald Trump came to power in January of 2017, he decided to give the Saudis an almost completely blank check in Yemen. All of Obama's last-minute limits on Saudi Arabia's conduct were lifted. For 4 years, Trump and his people did all they could to protect the Saudi invasion of Yemen in the face of growing outrage internationally, among the U.S. public, and finally, even unprecedented levels of opposition within the U.S. Congress. Trump's maximum pressure policy, as with Iran, just made the Houthis more powerful. Trump's justification for all this savagery was the Houthi connection with Iran, which is a little strange. This is one of the biggest and most consistent disconnects I have seen in my 10 years of analyzing geopolitics. Everybody in Washington, D.C., Republican and Democrat, government bureaucrat or think tanker, insists that Yemen's Houthis are Iranian proxy forces. Yet every academic that I have read that actually studies Yemen insists that this is nonsense. The Houthis are independent from Iran and frequently act against Iran's wishes, in ways that, say, Lebanon's Hezbollah never would. There are certainly close ties between the countries, and Yemen owes some of its current missile and drone capabilities to Iranian technology. But the consensus is that the main reason Iran decided to provide this support to the Houthis is the war that Saudi Arabia launched in 2015. Let me repeat that. The main result of this Saudi and U.S. war against Iranian influence in Yemen has been dramatically stepped up Iranian influence in Yemen. In 2022, after 7 years of war, the Yemenis did use Iranian technology to end the conflict. But the largest supplier of weapons to the Houthis for the most important periods of this war were actually probably the United States of America. Remember that for the first years of the Saudi invasion, the Houthis were allied with Yemen's old dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. What made Saleh such a valuable ally in this period was his control over the elements of the Yemeni military that he had built up over the course of his dictatorship. And as we covered in episode 4, the United States poured tons of money and resources into Yemen's military after 9/11. So for most of the war against the Saudi invasion, the U.S. provided most of the weapons for both sides. It was only at the end of 7 years of war with Saudi Arabia that the Yemenis accumulated enough Iranian missile tech to meaningfully change the conflict. Anyway, back in 2017, the switch from Obama to Trump looked like a big break for the Saudis. But that was nothing compared to what happened in December of 2017. It wasn't just the end of the Houthi-Saleh partnership, it was the end of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been the most important figure in Yemeni politics for just shy of 40 years. As late as 2017, people were still assuming that Ali Abdullah Saleh was the real power in the Houthi-Saleh coalition that controlled the majority of Yemen's population. Many thought that the battle between the old men that had controlled Yemen for decades was more important than the upstart militia from the north. This mistake was made by many Western analysts, and it was made by Saleh himself. Over the course of 2017, Saleh's marginalization became clearer and clearer. By August, he and his inner circle had been cut out of decision-making by the Houthis, and by November, his movements in Sana'a had been limited. He decided to execute one of the trademark betrayals he had carried out so many times before, turning on the Houthis and announcing openness to working with the Saudis. This was a mistake. The Houthis killed him on December 4, 2017. In 2017, Saudi Arabia got a U.S. president that was willing to give them a completely blank check in Yemen, and they got the death of their great enemy, Ali Abdullah Saleh. If Saudi Arabia had a good year in this war, it was 2017. And they completely failed to capitalize on it. Why was that? Well, I can see three main reasons. First off, no unity in the anti-Houthi opposition. Second, insane Saudi leadership. And number three, Donald Trump himself. In January 2018, the hope was that the death of Saleh would lead to chaos in the Houthi north. Instead, we saw chaos in the south, as open fighting broke out between the Hadi-led Saudi proxy government and the UAE-sponsored Southern Transition Council. The Saudi proxy government had been installed back in Aden in 2015, but President Hadi had never permanently returned from Saudi Arabia due to security issues. We hear a lot in the United States about how poorly administered the Houthi territories are, with some justification. But in the Houthi territories, power is solidified, and there are some attempts to operate a modern state. The Saudi and UAE proxies have never managed to put that together in the few scraps of territory that they control. For much of the war, especially after 2016, the Saudi and UAE proxies have spent more time negotiating with each other than they have with the Houthis. In January 2018, the Southern Transition Council stopped negotiating and went to war against Hadi's internationally recognized government. Hundreds died in what is now remembered as the Battle of Aden. More negotiations did follow, but by the end of 2019, this conflict resulted in the Hadi government's ejection from the only large Yemeni city it ever had control of. In the years since, intermittent fighting has usually been followed by deals intended to bring a unified government back to the south, but 6 years later, the STC faction is still the main power in Aden. Power in Yemen's non-Houthi regions has now curdled into regional fragments. Remember that as large as these fragments look on the map, outside of Aden there isn't any real population density. The anti-Houthi factions mostly control big chunks of desert. I don't doubt that many in the north would love to be rid of the Houthis, but we need to face the fact that the internationally recognized government has never provided a real alternative. The few fleeting victories the Gulf Coalition has achieved, like that over Aden, are quickly squandered by infighting between different factions. This is probably the main reason for Gulf failure in Yemen. Despite all of their wealth and power, the only alternative to the Houthis that they are offering is a divided wasteland. The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman we have today, affably traveling the world, wasting his country's money, is a very different person from the guy that we saw in his first years in power. During the first Trump administration, No Limits MBS was a lunatic. In June 2017, MBS had to be restrained from invading Qatar, a small Gulf state that hosts one of the world's largest U.S. military bases. In November 2017, he kidnapped the Prime Minister of Lebanon and forced him to resign. That same month, he attempted to go beyond the already ruinous blockade of Yemen and starve the country to death with a total ban on food and fuel imports. Starving tens of millions of people to death was too much for even Donald Trump, who forced a reversal of the policy within a month. In October of 2018, MBS finally went too far and used one of his consulates to murder Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi was a Washington Post columnist and a personal friend, or at least acquaintance, of many elite Washington, D.C. officials and journalists. It's obscene that U.S. government and media seem to care more about this one guy than they had about the tens of thousands of Yemenis that had been bombed and starved to death by that point, but that is the world that we live in. The murder of this one guy seems to have impacted U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia even more than 9/11 did. Though that has a lot to do with the way the oil market flipped between 2001 and 2018, but that's a story for an even longer video. MBS and Saudi Arabia are much more calming influences today, 7 years later, more risk-averse, with a much better sense of their own weaknesses. But in those crucial years, 2017 and 2018, when Saudi Arabia had a blank check from Donald Trump and the Houthi-Salah alliance was terminated, the anti-Houthi forces were led by a lunatic. Everybody could see it, which fueled the third major force in Saudi failure in Yemen. The third main reason that the Saudi invasion of Yemen failed is Donald Trump himself, and how uniquely hated he was in U.S. politics. Normally, and especially now, U.S. foreign policy is fiercely, horrifically bipartisan. It's incredibly rare for there to be any serious pushback against whatever a U.S. president wants to do abroad. We saw this with both Vietnam and Iraq. Two illegal and obviously idiotic wars were undertaken at great cost to the United States in the face of the advice of anybody who knew anything about these countries. It took years and piles of dead U.S. soldiers for any serious steps out of those wars to be undertaken. And despite a complete turn of public and political opinion, we are still in Iraq today. Frankly, Yemen isn't the sort of thing that U.S. politics typically cares about. U.S. involvement was essential to the invasion, but it was pretty deniable and honestly pretty small. As far as I know, in a decade of fighting, we've only lost a single U.S. Special Forces soldier, and most of the money wasted was Saudi money. When the Obama administration soured on the Gulf invasion of Yemen, it was more because of their own lawyers and bleeding-heart liberals than the small public pressure campaign that had already started. But Donald Trump was different. Not just the Democratic Party, but the entire bipartisan foreign policy establishment went to war against him. This meant that things that were traditionally off-limits for public discussion became plausible weapons against the hated Trump. This meant we got a more powerful public discussion about Yemen than we have had about any other recent U.S. conflict. There are a handful of tiny nonprofits in Washington, D.C. dedicated to documenting most of the evil stuff that we do. Their big victories are usually on the order of getting some minor congressperson to spend an afternoon introducing some protest legislation that never gets discussed or voted on. Donald Trump's embrace of the Saudi war in Yemen created a very different situation. At the time, I found it inspiring. Multiple congresspeople, including a tripartisan set of powerful senators, Chris Murphy, Bernie Sanders, and Mike Lee, made Yemen one of their signature issues. Year by year, congressional votes against the war and Saudi weapons sales got closer and closer to success. The conflict in Yemen became the centerpiece of bipartisan advocacy against the Pentagon's forever wars. In the end, congressional opposition was never able to seriously impact U.S. participation or funding of the war through legislation, but I believe it helped to convince the Saudis and Emiratis that their war against the Houthis was hopeless. By July of 2018, the Saudi and Emirati proxy forces had briefly stopped fighting each other over Aden and belatedly decided to try to capitalize on the death of Salah 7 months earlier. The plan was to take the port of Hodeidah. This is the great what-if that DC hawks and anti-Houthi Yemenis focus on. The invaders and southern forces had finally had some success moving up the coast. The Hodeidah port remains the Houthi movement's main outlet to the world. If the anti-Houthis and their supporters had been allowed to take it, many argue that surely the Houthis would have been defeated. I don't buy it. Hodeidah isn't just a lifeline for the Houthis, it's the main source of food for the majority of the Yemeni population. If the port had been taken by the invaders and their proxies, or more likely just destroyed, the Houthis would have just moved their front lines back a bit. Their power would have been minorly impacted, but millions of Yemeni civilians could have starved to death. The UN and most outside analysts agreed that it wasn't worth the risk. And because everybody in Washington, D.C. hated Donald Trump, for once, sanity prevailed. Saudi Arabia helped sanity win by murdering Jamal Khashoggi in October of 2018. Congressional pressure led to U.S. government pressure on the Saudis and Emiratis to call the offensive off. The Hodeidah offensive ended in November 2018 with a UN-brokered agreement over the use of the port that nobody ever on it. The 2018 Hodeida offensive is now seen as the last chance to defeat the Houthis, with some reason. Nothing since has come close. But even if the Hodeida offensive succeeded, I don't think that the desperately divided and dysfunctional Gulf coalition would have been able to make any real headway in the Houthis' North Yemeni heartlands. 2019 is the year that the Gulf invasion of Yemen ended. The United Arab Emirates figured this out fairly quickly and acted accordingly. It took Saudi Arabia another 3 years to fully get the message. The effectiveness of the UAE's armed forces has been greatly exaggerated. They are small and really not that smart. The chaos in Libya, Sudan, Somalia, and Ethiopia indicates the foolishness of relying on the UAE to run the region, the way the U.S. has for over a decade now. But compared to the sad joke that is the Saudi military and Saudi foreign policy apparatus, the Little Sparta nickname that Trump's defense secretary Jim Mattis gave to the UAE makes some sense. After 2015, the UAE didn't make any progress against the Houthis, but by 2019, they had won a lot in Yemen. Their money, backed up with actual UAE boots on the ground, which Saudi Arabia never had in the south, built up a dense network of friendly militias. The more powerful elements of the south didn't agree on much, but they did agree on UAE sponsorship. The United Arab Emirates was happy to deal with the separate powers in each Yemeni port individually, creating a sort of old-school Venice-type port-based maritime empire. In March 2019, the U.S. congressional campaign against the war in Yemen reached its high point with the unprecedented passage of a War Powers Resolution requiring the removal of U.S. forces from the Yemen conflict. Trump vetoed this resolution, one of the few vetoes of his presidency, but the manifest disapproval of the U.S. Congress played a key role in emphasizing to the UAE just how unpopular their war was. Not just with the U.S. public, but with the U.S. congresspeople that the United Arab Emirates rely upon for their protection. 3 months later, the UAE announced their withdrawal from the war. And why not? They'd already won everything they wanted. A UAE military presence was no longer necessary to maintain relationships with the southern militias and their ports. UAE money could do that. And that UAE money is still flowing today. The 2019 UAE withdrawal didn't end the fighting and it didn't end the humanitarian crisis, but it made the hopelessness of the Saudi invasion apparent. Rather than limit the UAE-sponsored southern separatists, UAE withdrawal emboldened them to complete their takeover of Aden in August 2019, kicking out the Saudi-sponsored government entirely. Saudi Arabia was still bombing, but they had lost most influence on the ground in Yemen. At the time, I was ecstatic. The U.S. Congress had finally reasserted itself. The War Powers Resolution mechanism dated back to the 1970s, but it had never been used in so significant a way before. Had we finally turned the corner in the fight against forever wars? Were we in a new era where the U.S. Congress would rebel against crimes against humanity that our military was participating in? I believed it. I believed it all the way down until October of last year. What Gaza has made clear to me is that no, we had not become a better country over Yemen. The U.S. Congress just really didn't like Donald Trump. 2019 also taught the Saudis that not even they could rely on Donald Trump. On September 14th, 2019, half of Saudi Arabia's oil production capacity went up in flames. The destruction was quickly corrected, but MBS's silly little war in Yemen took 5% of world oil production offline for a day or two. The Houthis had been ineffectually lobbing missiles at Saudi Arabia since the war started, but this 2019 drone attack was something completely different. It was such a shocking step up in Houthi capabilities that many believe the Iranians may have carried it out directly and just had the Houthis claim credit. Regardless, this attack was a watershed in Saudi foreign policy. For decades, they had assumed that the U.S. security umbrella would protect their oil industry. After this shockingly effective attack, they looked to Washington, D.C. for revenge or at least reassurance, and Donald Trump did absolutely nothing. It's one of the best foreign policy moves he ever made. For decades, the Saudis had willingly partnered with the United States to keep Iran a pariah state. One of Saudi Arabia's main delusions about the war in Yemen is that it is a proxy war against Iran. The September 2019 attack finally made it clear to the Saudis how dangerous such a war with Iran could be. They finally understood that the broader U.S.-Iranian war they'd been working towards for decades would destroy their oil industry, and so they have shifted policy to avoid it. On the regional level, Saudi Arabia started reaching out to Iran, a long process that eventually culminated in the supposedly China-mediated deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023. The Saudis kept bombing Yemen until 2022, but after 2019, they became much more interested in reaching out to the Houthis. The problem was that in 2019, the Houthis weren't ready to talk yet. The 2015 to 2019 Gulf invasion of Yemen completely failed to dislodge the Houthis, but it may have managed to permanently break Yemen. In 2015, the Houthis were on the brink of conquering the whole country. The various now heavily armed militias of today, operating on their own southern turf, may have permanently barred that option. The durability of Yemen's fragmentation has a lot to do with Gulf funding, but it also has to do with the war itself. Wars create their own economies. Wars create vast classes of losers, but they also create a small class of winners that become interested in the continuation of those wars. Profiteering warlords are a factor among the Houthis and across the south. As one example, Yemen's third city, Taiz, has been divided between the Houthis and multiple southern factions since 2016. Large-scale fighting does occasionally crop up, but all sides of the war seem to be content to sit back and profit off of lucrative smuggling and extortion opportunities. This is, of course, horrible for the citizens of Taiz and for the population of the rest of Yemen that has to deal with similar dynamics. I'm sure that most of the fighters on the ground also hate this. The problem is that their leaders are profiting off of this division, which has given the war a life of its own, which makes a true military victory for either side much more difficult. The Houthis learned this the hard way between 2019 and 2022 when they tried and failed to capitalize on the collapse of the Gulf invasion. The offensive they launched did eventually change the front lines meaningfully, but it did so at immense cost, and with nowhere near the conclusive power that the Houthis had hoped. Before we move on to the Biden era, it's important to notice the result of 4 years of Trump policy in Yemen. It's true that Saudi Arabia is not a fully independent country, and it will always be restrained by U.S. squeamishness. But for 4 years, Donald Trump gave MBS an almost completely free rein, a blank check in Yemen, and the result was nothing. In 2020, Saudi Arabia looked weaker in Yemen and regionally than it did at the beginning of the Trump period. Maximum pressure on Yemen has been tried, and maximum pressure on Yemen has failed. By 2020, the province of Marib was almost the only part of Yemen that the Saudi proxy government had any control over. Marib is at the edge of the desert and has a majority Sunni population, making it much easier to protect with a tribesmen-Saudi Air Force combo. Over the course of the war, it has been claimed that the previously sparsely populated province has become home to 1 million-plus internally displaced refugees. Unfortunately for those refugees, Marib is also the heart of Yemen's small but somewhat lucrative oil industry. If the Houthis could take Marib, they would not just reduce Yemen's vulnerability to Saudi blockade, they would have knocked one of the last legs out from under the Gulf proxy government. So that's what the Houthis have tried to do for 10 bloody years. There had been attacks on Marib from the beginning of the war, but before 2020, it was sometimes seen as a place of relative calm. In 2020, it became the Houthis' main focus, just as the country was falling into a more war-torn version of the COVID crisis experienced everywhere else. The Marib offensive was a horrific meat grinder, both for the Houthis and for Marib's defenders. But it may have helped to end the war by showing both sides that there was not much more to be gained from further fighting. Tens of thousands died in this battle between 2020 and 2022. Most report that these deaths were disproportionately Houthi, with indoctrinated and perhaps coerced soldiers, leading to an even more disproportionate body count than is usual for attacking forces. But by October and November of 2021, the Houthis seemed to be on the cusp of reaching their goal. Then a number of things happened rather quickly. The Saudis and the Emiratis stepped up their efforts to keep the Houthis from winning the war. A renewal of heavy airstrikes combined with the redeployment of the most impressive of the UAE proxy forces didn't just stop the Houthis' horrifically costly advance, it partially reversed it. In the first months of 2022, UAE-sponsored militias successfully pushed the Houthis out of some of their 2021 winnings. Enraged to find themselves back where they had started in 2020, after horrific losses, the Houthis decided to demonstrate some of the drone and missile capacities that they had developed with Iranian help. In January 2022, the Houthis managed to strike Abu Dhabi in the UAE. In March, they hit an oil facility in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, during a Formula One car race. That absurd little detail illustrates the new dynamic that ended the war. The Houthis, even today, are incapable of striking Gulf cities with any real volume. But that doesn't matter, because the realities of these Gulf countries are so fragile. Both countries, especially Saudi Arabia in recent years, have marketed themselves as destinations for luxury tourism and high-end business. You can't market yourself to oligarchs if there are missiles falling on your car races. That simple truth ended the war. In 2022, the Houthis established the principle that if the Gulf bombs Yemen, Yemen can bomb back. And that ended the war almost immediately. Honestly, Iran should get the Nobel Peace Prize for giving the Yemenis this technology. Nothing is solved, of course. The country is still divided and low-level fighting continues. But for a couple years at least, the Houthis have been too exhausted to push further into the south, and the Gulf Air Force of the Southern Separatists has been too afraid to bomb the north. April 2022's UN-brokered truce was renewed twice, and then it expired in October of 2022. But fighting did not restart, and it has not restarted 2.5 years later. Yemen is at something close to relative peace, because both sides recognized that they were unlikely to gain anything from further fighting. Nobody is satisfied with this result, but that's often how wars end. The Saudis are so uninterested in continuing the fight that now that the U.S. is bombing the Houthis, the Saudis are counseling restraint and caution, even though they had desperately wanted U.S. intervention in the 2010s. The war wasn't the only thing the Saudis gave up on in Yemen 2 years ago. On April 7, 2022, in the 11th year of his 2-year term, Saudi Arabia finally made fake President Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi resign. It was difficult to let go of the scraps of international legitimacy he still represented, but the invasion had failed, and Hadi's forces no longer controlled much of Yemen's small anti-Houthi territory anyway. Hadi was replaced by an 8-man presidential leadership council. This was a vast improvement over Hadi, including representatives of most of the anti-Houthi forces that mattered on the ground. I would love to give more detail on the fascinatingly diverse personalities of the PLC, but this video is long enough already. There was a lot of hope invested in this council, but 2 years later that hope has mostly faded. The council is much more representative of the anti-Houthi factions, but it has even less democratic legitimacy than Hadi did. The council was hand-picked in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh, was unveiled in Riyadh, and holds its less and less frequent meetings in Riyadh. Despite this, the situation in the south has continued to get worse for Saudi Arabia because members of the Presidential Leadership Council continue to take territory from each other. And once again, it's the United Arab Emirates that seems to be the big winner in the recent infighting, just as it's been the UAE that seems to be the only winner throughout the duration of this war. Yemen's anti-Houthi rebels have very little control over the interior of the country, but they do control a lot of ports, and it's ports that the UAE's maritime neo-empire has always been interested in. Saudi Arabia has one move left, and it's a doozy. It would be a repeat of a move they made at the end of Yemen's last civil war in the 1960s. Having lost the war, they can simply switch sides and start working with the Houthis. This would completely turn the tables on their crappy UAE allies, which would have a real poetry to it. It could even bring real peace and stability to Yemen, though at great cost to the south. That would be an incredibly risky move, though, both for the Saudis and the world. You know who else teamed up with the Houthis after waging an ineffectual war against them that made the Houthis much more powerful? Ali Abdullah Saleh. He made that alliance, and it killed him. There's no guarantee that such an alliance would work out any better for the Saudis than it did for Ali Abdullah Saleh. The Houthis are terrifyingly effective. 20 years ago, they were living in caves, losing tribal negotiations. In 2024, they have spent the past 6 months humiliating the U.S. Navy, likely the most powerful military force humanity has ever constructed. I consider myself a defender of U.S. empire and the status quo, even if I am currently appalled by our genocide in Gaza. I'm also a student of history, so I'm constantly looking out for that unheralded threat that comes screaming out of the wasteland to overturn complacent societies like the 7th century Arabs or the 13th century Mongols. In my decades of looking out for such a threat, the Houthis are the first force that has me legitimately worried. I'm not saying it's likely that these guys will be in control of Islam's 2 holy cities by the 2040s, but they are much more likely candidates for that than the Saudi royal family that controls them today. Our cultivation of the weakest possible leaders in the oil-rich Arab world, combined with our merciless bombing and occasional genocide campaigns on the Gulf monarchies' borders, have produced a truly toxic mix of justified anger and virulent anti-Semitism. Now, I don't use the term anti-Semitism lightly. Israel has done and is doing horrible things in the Arab world, and it's never made much sense to me to police the language of Arabs as they're being bombed to death. But the Houthis put their anti-Semitism on their fucking flag. My contrarian nature compels me to point out that the Houthis are less anti-Semitic than the government of Israel. The Houthis at least acknowledge that Israel and the Jewish people are 2 different things, which Israel does not. But that's besides the point. Outside of Ukraine, the Houthis are probably the most impressive new military organization in the world right now, and they are marching under a banner of hatred.
And the Houthis don't just talk the anti-Semitic talk, they walk the walk. Unlike the Islamic Republic of Iran, which carefully protects the thousands of Jews who still live there, the Houthis appear to have driven out the final remnants of Yemen's millennia-old Jewish population. Only a few dozens of Jews had resisted the siren call of Israel's living standards before the Houthis came to power, but it will always be Yemen's current rulers that finally ended these thousands of years of Jewish cultural continuity.
And unlike the Palestinians or the Lebanese, the Houthis attacked Israel before Israel attacked the Houthis. The Houthis chose anti-Semitism as a brand to organize around. It wasn't forced on them. I will confess to being impressed by the Houthis in the past. They are an indigenous resistance movement that defeated an outside invasion. That's awesome. And it was also kind of fun to watch the Saudi architects of 9/11 get humiliated. But now that they have won their war and they are building their brand abroad, it's time to nip this thing in the bud. It's clear that military force is useless against the Houthis. The strategy of attempting to crush them has taken them from the caves of northern Yemen to negotiating from a position of strength with the richest countries in the world. What we need now is a strategy of alternatives. Supporting a modern Arab democracy like Tunisia would have been nice, but we let that slowly die after 10 years of doing nothing to support it. In the next round of regional discord, which I assure you is coming soon, let's identify and support those democratic alternatives instead of supporting regional partners that are so bad, the Gulf monarchies, that it makes radical hate-mongers like the Houthis look more legitimate by comparison. The most important weapon against the Houthis is peace. The year and a half between April 2022 and October 7th, 2023, is widely recognized as one of the most difficult and dangerous in the history of the Houthi movement. They had won their war, and without their messianic mission against Saudi imperialism, governance all of a sudden started to look really hard. The Houthis were in serious trouble until the Israelis gave them a new mission. The Houthis did Yemen a great service by defeating the Saudis and Emiratis, but over the past year they have demonstrated that they care more about making themselves look cool than they do about the Yemeni people. Their crusade against Red Sea shipping is far more likely to destroy Egypt than it is to save a single Palestinian life. Even if you believe that it is heroic to fight against Israel's genocide the way the Houthis are, it's a tremendous burden to put on the Yemeni people that have just survived a decade of war. And the Yemeni people were never asked if they wanted to do this. Is it really worth it to make protests as pointless as the ones that the Houthis are making? On July 19th, 2024, the Houthi leadership gleefully reported that they'd sent a drone all the way to Tel Aviv to murder a single Israeli citizen. The next day, Israel blew up one of Yemen's very few operating oil refineries, causing untold suffering to the Yemeni people. This refinery was in the Hodeidah port that the UN and the U.S. Congress had protected from the Saudis back in 2018. It was true back then, and true today, that any interruption to the flow of petroleum into Yemen would have horrific humanitarian costs. And the Houthis invited the Israeli attack, without saving a single Palestinian life. Unlike Israel's attacks on Gaza and Lebanon, the Israeli airstrikes in Yemen aren't even illegal. They may be cruel and disproportionate, but they are self-defense. Yemen's Houthi government fired first. Regardless, Israel's Gaza genocide is supercharging the Houthi movement. It gave them a mission that not only made them more popular than ever across Yemen, it made them heroes across the Arab world and in the global South in general. The U.S. and Israel's laughably ineffective attempts to bomb the Red Sea blockade open have only added to Houthi prestige. The first step to defeating the Houthis is taking their shiny new cause away from them. We desperately need a ceasefire in Gaza. Recall that the Houthis failed to take Marib after 2 bloody years of trying. Without the added recruits and local and international legitimacy that Israel's genocide is giving them, the Houthis have probably hit their natural limit. If the anti-Houthi rebels can stop fighting each other and present a united front for a year, real negotiations might be possible. Ending Gulf management of Yemen's opposition, while preserving Gulf funding, is probably the first step towards a useful anti-Houthi front in Yemen. Even with U.S. bombs raining down on the country, Yemen today is more peaceful than it has been in a decade. We need to build on that. What we really don't need is a broader U.S. and Israeli war against Iran. Such a war is likely to lead to millions of deaths, a new and angrier government in Tehran, and it might just result in an Israel that directly borders enlarged and enraged Turkish and Houthi empires. Or perhaps I'm overemphasizing Yemen's importance because I've just been looking at the country for way too long. Regardless, I hope this tour of Yemen's history has made it clear to you that you should not mess with Yemen. The country has seen off empire after empire for over 1,000 years. If I were in charge of the world or the region, I would be working as hard as I possibly could to just leave Yemen alone. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. I hope you've enjoyed this years-long journey into Yemen's history of defeating empires. If you've enjoyed this series or anything else you've seen on the More Freedom Foundation, I'd be very grateful if you signed up on Patreon. If you sign up for Patreon, you get patrons-only newscasts. You get patrons-only chats on our Discord server. And also, yes, did I mention there is a patrons-only Discord server? Please do sign up, and thanks for being here.